1612, the colony had discovered a new means of support when John Rolfe successfully cultivated the first tobacco crop in the colony, an industry that to this point had been controlled by the Spanish. Later, he married the daughter of Chief Powhatan, a girl named Pocahontas, who changed her name to Rebecca when she converted to Christianity, which led to a temporary truce with the native people. By 1617, tobacco exports to England totaled 20,000 pounds. The next year's shipments more than doubled that. By 1630, 1.5 million pounds were being exported annually, and the first great American enterprise had been established. Despite the introduction of tobacco cultivation, though, the colony was a failure as a financial venture, with investors losing a total of about 200,000 pounds. That's the coinage, not the weight. The king declared the Virginia Company bankrupt in 1624 and took over the colony, making it the first colony in America to be ruled by the crown. Because tobacco was such a labor-intensive crop, and the company wanted to encourage the planting of as much tobacco as possible, they introduced the headright system in Jamestown beginning in 1618. The way the system worked is that anyone who paid for passage to the Jamestown colony would have the right to claim 50 acres of land for themselves, plus 50 more acres of land for each additional person or servant whom they brought along. This rapidly led to numerous wealthy individuals dominating very large tracts of land and bringing numerous indentured servants to work tobacco fields. By 1619, slavery had been introduced, and the headright system also allowed for the 50 acres of land to be awarded to anyone who imported a slave. After the establishment of Jamestown, another Chesapeake colony would also be established further to the north. Maryland was actually the third English colony, but the second in the Chesapeake region. Like Plymouth, that we'll talk about shortly, and unlike Jamestown, religion was a primary motivating factor for its creation. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, a high-ranking member of the government under King James I, he and his family converted to Catholicism, forcing him to give up those lucrative government positions, as Catholics were not allowed to serve in any official government capacity. Having done many favors for the king over the years, which usually translates into giving the king money, George Calvert would approach James's son, Charles I, once Charles was on the throne, about getting a grant of land in the colonies to discharge the debt. George Calvert died shortly before the charter was completed, and so his son Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, continued with it, gaining the charter in 1634, and sending two of his brothers along with the first settlers to actively manage the colony. Remember, laws of primogeniture meant that those younger brothers of his would not inherit anything in England. Maryland was intended to be a haven for Catholics who were persecuted in England, although about 2/3 of the first settlers were actually not Catholic at all. The colony was run a little like a feudal holding, with Baltimore owning all the land, and the settlers to whom he granted land to paying him an annual rent. But tensions between the wealthy Catholic landowners and the poorer Protestant farmers persisted. In 1649, to alleviate some of the tension, the Maryland legislature passed an act of toleration, authorizing all Christians to freely worship in the colony. Eventually, though, the government was seized from the Calverts, partly due to the slow response that the colony had in swearing allegiance to the new king and queen after the accession of William of Orange and Queen Mary, who was the daughter of James II. After James II was deposed for converted to Catholicism and begetting a Catholic heir, who would of course inherit before any of his older Protestant sisters. At that time, Catholics would lose all political rights in Maryland until after the American Revolution. Turning northward, we now look at the New England region. The colony of Plymouth was actually the second English colony to be established in 1620. The founders there had an entirely different mission from Jamestown. Although they still wanted economic prosperity, their true goal was spiritual. Fed up with the ceremonial Church of England, Pilgrims and Puritans sought to recreate a society in the manner that they believed God truly intended it to be designed. Pilgrims and Puritans both believed in the teachings of John Calvin. According to Calvin, neither the Catholic nor the Anglican churches were addressing God's will. And although during Elizabeth's reign, England allowed for the worship of many different faiths, you're going to see persecution increase once the Stuart family and James I ascended to the throne. King James and his son Charles actively supported the Church of England, but secretly admired the ceremonies of the Catholic Church. And to these men, John Calvin was a heretic and a man whose soul was doomed for his religious views. The people that would become the Pilgrims, or at least the portion of them that organized the trip, called the Separatists in England because of their desire to separate from the Anglican Church, were therefore persecuted by agents of the throne. The Puritans, sort of the other half of those who objected to the Church of England, wanted to purify the Church of England from Catholic taint, and they experienced the same degree of harassment from government officials. By the second decade of the 1600s, both groups decided that England was no place for them to put their beliefs into practice. The separatists had actually tried relocating to Holland, but felt that there was too much godless practice going on there with their complete religious freedom, and their children were growing up less English and more Dutch. So in September of 1620, over 100 travelers embarked on a Mayflower. Now, less than a third of them were actually separatists, the rest being immigrants, adventurers, and speculators bound for Virginia. They had been granted permission to live north of Jamestown under that same charter. But that's not where they ended up. Supposedly lost at sea, they happened upon a piece of land that would become known as Cape Cod. After surveying the land, they set up camp not too far from the current town of Plymouth. They feared actually venturing further south because winter was fast approaching. They had arrived in November. But these pilgrims had an important question to answer before they actually set ashore. Since they were not landing within the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company, they had no charter to govern them. So who would rule their society? In the landmark Mayflower Compact of 1620, these pilgrims decided that they would simply rule themselves, based on a majority rule of the townsmen. Now, this independent attitude would set up a tradition of self-rule that would later lead to town meetings and even elected legislatures throughout New England. Now, one of the major similarities between Jamestown and the first Plymouth settlement was great human suffering. When they arrived, it was November, winter was fast approaching, and it was definitely too late to plant crops. Many settlers died of scurvy, a disease due to lack of vitamin C, as well as malnutrition during that first terrible winter. Of the 102 original Mayflower passengers, only 44 survived to spring. But the kindness of local Native Americans would save them. One man, Squanto, a local Indian who had actually been kidnapped and had even lived in England nearly a decade before and had made it back to North America, he spoke English and would serve as an interpreter with the local tribes. He taught the pilgrims to fertilize the very poor soil with the remains of dried fish in order to improve the productivity of the land. Massasoit, the chief of the nearby Wampanoag tribe, would sign a treaty of alliance with the pilgrims in exchange for assistance with the defense of the Massasoits people against their enemies, the Narragansett tribe. Massasoit would supplement the food supply of these pilgrims for the first several years of their colony's existence. Now, successful colonies require strong leadership, and the man who led this Plymouth colony after that first winter was William Bradford. He was elected governor for over 30 years. Under his guidance, Plymouth suffered less hardship than the English did down in Virginia, and relations with local Native Americans remained relatively smooth, and the food supply grew with each passing year. By the fall of 1621, these pilgrims had much to be thankful for, and so after the harvest, the English carried out the tradition of a harvest festival, inviting Massasoit and approximately 90 other Native Americans to join them for the feast. This is that traditional first Thanksgiving. Following Plymouth, New England began a rapid period of expansion as other religious dissenters left. The colony of Massachusetts Bay was next to be established in 1535. The founder, John Winthrop, he did not actually want to separate from the Church of England, but instead wanted to purify it of all Catholic taint. As the head of the joint stock company that established the colony, he exploited a loophole in the charter and opted to run the company from the colony itself, continuing the tradition of self-rule in the colonies that had begun with Plymouth. They elected a legislature, echoing the desire for self-government that was already seen in the other English colonies. Although ministers were prohibited from holding political office, setting up at least somewhat of a separation of church and state, many of the most important decisions were still made by the clergy. In 1636, just barely a year after being established, the colony established a college for the purpose of training Puritan ministers. That would be Harvard. By the end of the 1630s, as part of a great migration of Puritans out of England, the nearly 1,000 people that had initially settled Massachusetts Bay had grown to more than 15,000 as more and more Puritans came to Massachusetts and the colony began to spread. In fact, it grew so large and so powerful that by the 1690s, Plymouth colony, which still did not have a charter, was absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay colony. Interestingly, though, for a colony that had fled persecution in England, Massachusetts Bay was quick to persecute any who did not hold the same religious views as themselves. Members of other faiths had no political rights and were quick to be punished and imprisoned, and usually banished from the colony for the slightest wrongdoing. As dissent occurred, those who were banished left to form new colonies, like Thomas Hooker, who established Hartford, Connecticut, or Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who went on to establish Rhode Island. Even New Hampshire was established in somewhat of a similar manner, although those were more fishermen looking for other opportunities. In the case of New Hampshire, Massachusetts actually continued to try and exert its authority over that territory. But a series of lawsuits filed by those who were initially granted land in New Hampshire sent the decision as to whether or not New Hampshire was independent to the courts. And the courts decided against Massachusetts and in favor of the New Hampshire Charter in the 1670s. Maine was settled similarly, but would remain under the control of Massachusetts Bay Colony and then later the state of Massachusetts until it was formally separated in 1820.